The rain lashed against the leaded glass of the nursery like a hand beating against a door that would never open. It was the only sound in the suffocating silence of Ravenswick Hall. That and the soft, unknowing breath of a sleeping child. Euphemia stood at the cradle's edge, her ivory lace gown catching the guttering candlelight. One trembling hand pressed flat against the carved mahogany rail. She was not looking at Ainsley. Not yet. She had learned, in the weeks since his birth, that looking at him too long made her feel things she could not afford to feel in front of this man. So she stared at the middle distance, at the wallpaper, at nothing, and she breathed. She had felt Alistair enter before she heard him. 3 years of marriage had made her fluent in his particular silences. This one arrived ahead of him like a cold front, heavy, deliberate, shaped like a verdict already rendered. He did not cross the room. He stood in the shadow of the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, a man entirely at ease with the devastation he was about to administer. This was always a matter of arrangement, Euphemia. His voice did not rise, it never rose. It was the kind of voice that did not need to. You provided the air, I provided the title. Do not mistake the terms of our agreement for anything warmer than what they are. Outside, the storm hurled itself against Ravenswick's ancient stone as though the house itself recoiled. Inside, the single candle on the mantel faltered, not dramatically, not with defiance, but quietly, the way hope dies when it has waited too long for permission to live. You meant nothing to me, Alistair said. You never did. He turned and left. The nursery door closed behind him with a sound like a coffin being sealed, final, hollow, irreversible. For a long moment, Euphemia did not move. Then slowly she looked down at Ainsley, at the perfect curl of his small fist against his cheek, at the rise and fall of his chest, at the face that bore no trace of his father's coldness. 8 months old, and already the most whole person in this house. She smoothed the blanket once, then again, her jaw set. She had rehearsed crumbling 100 times across 3 years of careful silences and untouched dinners and nights spent beside a man who saved his warmth exclusively for ledgers and legacy. She had swallowed every tear in the maid's corridor, in the winter garden, into the dark. She would not cry now. She reached into the cradle and lifted her son. "We are leaving," she whispered against his hair. Not a question, not a plea. A fact, delivered to the only person in Ravenswick Hall she trusted with the truth. Ainsley stirred once, then settled against her chest, his breathing slow and certain. By the time the storm broke toward dawn, the nursery was empty. The cradle was cold, and the Duke of Ravenswick, who had built his entire existence on the certainty of control, was about to discover that the only things that had ever truly belonged to him, he had handed away with both hands and called it dignity. He had said she was nothing. He would spend everything he had left trying to prove himself wrong. My beautiful family, if this story has your heart racing, hit like and subscribe to join us daily. I'd love to know who is listening. Tell me your city and the time where you are, because I'd love to welcome you personally in the comments. The fire in the ducal bedchamber had burned itself to ash by the time Alistair woke. He did not stir with urgency. He was not a man given to urgency. It implied that something had slipped beyond his governance, and nothing at Ravenswick ever slipped beyond his governance. He dressed without haste, allowed his valet to see to his cravat, and descended the east staircase with the measured stride of a man who owned every floorboard beneath his feet. It was the silence on the upper corridor that stopped him. Not the ordinary silence of early morning, when the house held its breath before the staff began their rounds. This was a different quality entirely, evacuated, hollow, the silence of a room that had been deliberately emptied. He paused at the landing, one hand resting on the balustrade, and listened. Nothing. He told himself it meant nothing. He was at the nursery's door before he had consciously decided to walk there. It swung open without resistance. The candles had burned to stubs in their holders. The cradle stood at the center of the room, exactly as it always had, carved mahogany, polished to a gleam. The Kincaid crest worked into the headboard in low relief. The wool blanket Euphemia had ordered from Edinburgh was folded neatly over the rail. The cradle was empty. Alistair stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at it. His mind, trained by decades of discipline to process information without sentiment, moved through the possibilities in sequence. The infant was ill and had been removed to the physician's room. The nurse had taken him for an early feed. Euphemia had risen before dawn and carried him to the south parlour, where she sometimes sat with him in the grey morning light, believing no one knew. He checked every room. He descended to the kitchens, where the cook dropped a ladle at the sight of him, and stammered that she had not seen the mistress since supper the previous evening. He walked the length of the east wing. He checked the stables where the head groom, a weathered man not easily rattled, met his eyes and looked away. "The small carriage, Your Grace. Gone before 3 in the morning, begging your pardon." Alistair said nothing. He turned and walked back to the house with the same measured stride he had always employed. He mounted the stairs. He stood in the nursery doorway again, and this time he looked at the room as it actually was. The absence of the small silver rattle on the shelf. The absence of the linen stack beside the cradle. The absence of the portrait miniature Euphemia kept on the windowsill, the one of her mother, which she had carried from her family home on the morning of their wedding. She had not fled in panic. She had packed. The realization arrived not as a blow, but as something slower and more thorough, a cold that began at the center of him and moved outward toward his extremities, a cold that had nothing to do with the November air coming through the cracked window glass. She had planned this. She had stood in this room last night and listened to him speak, and she had already decided. Every word he delivered had fallen not on a woman about to break, but on a woman already gone. He crossed to the cradle and placed one hand on the empty blanket. In 34 years, Alistair Roderick Kincaid had never once permitted himself to feel the specific terror of being left. His father had been a distant monument, his mother a woman of correct conduct and carefully managed feeling, and he had learned from both of them that need was a form of weakness a Kincaid could not afford. He had built his life on that principle. He had built his marriage on it. He had last night, with characteristic precision, used it as a weapon. He stared at the empty cradle and understood, for the first time in his adult life, that he had made a catastrophic error. He did not shout for the staff. He did not immediately summon his solicitor or dispatch riders. He stood in the cold nursery in the grey morning light with his hand on an empty blanket, and for exactly 4 minutes. He would later remember this with strange clarity. He did nothing at all. Then he straightened, removed his hand, turned toward the door. He had a great deal to do. The search began methodically, as all things Alistair undertook began, with information gathered and assessed before action was taken. He summoned his estate manager. He sent discreet inquiries to the coaching inns on the northern road and the post houses along the Edinburgh route. He interviewed the groom a second time, more carefully, learning that Euphemia had managed the business of hiring a driver from outside the estate entirely, a man from the village whose name no one thought to record. She had thought of everything. By midday, he had 2 confirmed sightings placing a woman matching Euphemia's description, carrying an infant, boarding a northbound coach at Callander. By evening, the trail went cold somewhere in the first foothills of the Highlands, swallowed by a landscape that had been hiding people from powerful men since before the Kincaids had a title to their name. Morven found him in the library at 9 that evening, standing at the window with an untouched glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at the dark. "She's taken Ainsley," he said, without turning. "I know," Morven replied. She sat down in the chair nearest the fire, uninvited, and folded her hands in her lap, with the particular composure of a woman preparing to say something that would not be well received. "Alistair, I will find them. I don't doubt it." A pause. "The question is what you intend to do when you do." He turned from the window then. His face was composed, as it always was. But Morven had known him since childhood, and she saw what lived beneath the composure. Not anger. Not wounded pride, fear, pure, undisguised, unfamiliar fear. She said nothing more that evening. She simply stayed. Outside, the rain had not stopped. Lachlan Murray Strathmore arrived at Ravenswick on the second morning without an invitation, without announcement, and without the faintest inclination toward civility. He came on horseback through driving rain, his military greatcoat dark with water, and he dismounted in the courtyard with the brisk efficiency of a man who had crossed difficult terrain in worse conditions and expected no praise for it. He handed his reins to the groom without looking at him and walked directly to the front entrance, where he struck the door with the flat of his hand rather than the brass knocker. The butler, a man of long service and great composure, opened the door, registered the expression on Lachlan's face, and stepped aside without a word. Alistair met him in the entrance hall. They had never been easy with each other. That much had been established at the wedding, when Lachlan had shaken his new brother-in-law's hand, with the grip of a man communicating a warning rather than a welcome. 3 years of careful distance had preserved a surface civility between them, but the surface had always been thin, and they both knew it. It did not survive the first 10 seconds of this encounter. "Where is she?" Lachlan said. "If I knew that," Alistair replied, "I would not be standing here. If you had been half the man she deserved, she would not have gone." The entrance hall was very quiet. 2 footmen had developed urgent business in adjacent rooms. The butler had retreated to a respectful distance. Alistair looked at his brother-in-law steadily. "Come inside. I did not ride 40 miles through a Highland storm to sit in your drawing-room and take tea, Kincaid." "No." Alistair turned toward the study. "You rode 40 miles because she wrote to you, which means she planned this further in advance than I had estimated. Come inside, Strathmore. We can continue this conversation like men or like animals, but either way we are going to have it." A beat. Then Lachlan followed. The letter had arrived 2 days before Lachlan, dispatched from Euphemia at some point in the weeks preceding her flight. The postmark was smeared, beyond reading, but its contents were not. Lachlan did not show it to Alistair in full. He set it on the study desk, held flat by 2 fingers, and watched his brother-in-law's face as he read the visible portion. "She feared you would pursue her," Lachlan said. "She asked me to prevent it, and you intend to honor that request with everything I have." Alistair set the letter down. He moved to the window, a habit Morven had once observed of a man who needed the illusion of open ground when cornered, and stood with his back to the room. "Ainsley is my son and my heir," he said. His voice was even, controlled. "Ainsley," Lachlan said quietly, "is 8 months old and is with his mother, who is the only parent who has held him with something resembling love." The silence that followed had weight. "You do not know what passes between a man and his wife in private," Alistair said. "No," Lachlan agreed, "but I know what she looked like at Christmas, and at Easter, and at the christening. When you stood beside her in the chapel and shook the vicar's hand and smiled for the assembled guests, and she stood there in her good dress, looking like a woman performing the role of someone who was still alive." Alistair said nothing. I warned her, Lackland continued. He was not shouting. He had the voice of a man who had learned in the military that cold precision carried further than noise. Before the wedding, I told her the Kincaid name came at a price no woman should be asked to pay. She defended you. She said I did not understand you. He paused. She was too generous. She always was. I am going to find her, Alistair turned from the window. You may assist me or obstruct me, Strathmore, but you will not stop me. She is my wife, he is my son, and whatever I have done, and I am not yet prepared to account for it to you, I will not leave them alone and unprotected in the Highlands in November. Lackland studied him across the desk. Whatever he was looking for, he apparently did not find it, not entirely. But something shifted fractionally in the set of his jaw. If you find her, he said, and you cause her a single additional moment of the pain you have already caused her, I will not come for you with words. Understood. Another silence. Longer this time. I know the Highlands, Lackland said finally. You do not. Alistair looked at him. Are you offering to help me? I am offering to make certain you do not blunder through the glens like a lost estate agent and frighten her further north. He picked up his gloves from the desk. There is a difference. It was not alliance, it was not forgiveness, but it was, Alistair recognized, the only opening he was going to be given. We leave at first light, he said. Morven Sinclair Kincaid did not wait to be invited into difficult conversations. She had never found the habit useful, and 32 years of living had confirmed her instinct that the conversations most worth having were precisely the ones people worked hardest to avoid. She arrived in the study that evening to find Alistair alone, the map of the Northern Highlands spread across the desk, his second untouched glass of whiskey standing sentinel at its edge. Lackland had been installed in the East guest room with all the warmth of a formal ceasefire, two men who had agreed temporarily and without affection to want the same thing. The house had settled into the particular châtain of that arrangement, and the staff moved through it with the careful quiet of people who understood that something irreversible had happened and were waiting to learn its full dimensions. Morven sat across from her cousin, laced her fingers together, and said without preamble, You know why she left. I know what I said. Then you know. Alistair was quiet for a moment, turning his pen between his fingers in the slow, rhythmic way he had, when his mind was working faster than he wished to reveal. I said things I did not, Alistair. Her voice was not unkind, but it was the voice of a woman who had decided that kindness deployed here would be a form of cowardice she was not prepared to commit. I am not here to help you construct a defense. I am not here to offer you the comfort of extenuating circumstance. I am here because I am one of the 4 people in this country willing to tell you an uncomfortable truth, and you are going to need it before you find her. He set the pen down, looked at her across the lamplight. Go on. It was not last night, Morven said. Last night was simply the night. She stopped waiting for it to change. You have been telling Euphemia she was nothing for 3 years, not always in words. More often in the space where words should have been. In the dinners where you spoke at length to your steward and not one syllable to her. In the mornings you left before she woke, without note, without word, as though her sleeping presence did not merit acknowledgement. In every social occasion where you performed the role of attentive husband, with sufficient competence to satisfy an audience and insufficient sincerity to satisfy a wife. The fire shifted in the grate, a log settled, neither of them moved. She loved you, Morven continued, more quietly now, because the quieter register was the one that carried furthest. She came into this marriage with more warmth and more genuine goodwill than you had any right to expect, given your reputation, and she extended it toward you every day for 3 years. She extended it when you did not come to dinner. She extended it when you spoke to her in public with the polished courtesy you would show a business acquaintance. She extended it at the christening when you shook 30 hands and smiled for 30 faces, and never once, not once, sought out hers across the room. "I am aware," Alastair said very low, "that I was not what she—" "You were cruel," Morven said, not with heat, simply with accuracy. Not with intention, perhaps. Intentional cruelty would almost be easier to address, because it implies a decision that can be reversed. What you practiced was something more insidious. The cruelty of indifference, of a man so armored against his own feeling that he could not perceive the damage the armor was doing to the person standing nearest to him. He rose, walked to the fire, stewed with one forearm on the mantel and looked into it, and Morven, who had known him since they were children, and she had followed him through the corridors of his father's estate, with the determined persistence of a younger cousin who refused to be left behind, recognized this particular stillness. It was not the stillness of a man composing himself. It was the stillness of a man finally, reluctantly, coming to terms with a version of himself he had invested considerable energy in not seeing. She gave him the silence he needed. She was good at that. The strategic deployment of quiet, which was different from the kind that wounded. "She is carrying another secret," Morven said, when she judged the moment right. He turned from the fire. "I am not certain," she said carefully. "I have no proof, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I have known Euphemia well enough these 3 years to read the small registers of her, the way she holds herself, the way her attention moves through a room. In the month before she left, she carried herself differently, a particular kind of inwardness. She watched you across rooms in a way that was not anger and not hope. Something older than both. Something that had already incorporated the loss of you and was quietly making arrangements." Alastair stared at her. The implication settled over the room like a change in weather pressure. "Are you telling me she may be?" "I am telling you," Morven said firmly, "that when you find her, you must find her as a husband, not as a duke reclaiming what the law entitles him to, not as a man of wounded pride reasserting governance over his household, not even as a father, though you are one, and must be. You must find her as the man she married, the man she believed was somewhere inside the architecture you built around yourself." She paused. "She married you believing in that man, Alastair. She spent 3 years looking for him. The least you can do is produce him." She rose and smoothed her skirts, preparing to leave him with it. "Morven." She paused at the door. "What did I do?" he asked, and his voice had shed every layer of its usual construction. The ducal composure, the measured authority, the careful distance, and what remained was simply a man in a cold room asking a genuine question to make her believe I felt nothing. Morven held the doorframe and considered her answer with the care it deserved. "You never once told her otherwise," she said at last. "And silence, in a marriage, is never neutral. It always means something. She simply spent 3 years deciding what yours meant." She met his eyes. She decided correctly. She left him at the fire. The clock on the mantel marked 9, then the quarter hour, then the half. He did not move. The whiskey on the desk remained untouched. Outside, the rain continued its patient work against the stones of Ravenswick, wearing at them the way time wears at everything. Slowly, without malice, and without the slightest intention of stopping. They rode north at first light through a landscape the color of iron and old grief. Alastair had traveled the highlands before, twice, on shooting expeditions organized by men who treated wilderness as an amenity, an atmospheric backdrop for sport and whiskey, and the performance of vigorous masculinity. He had observed the terrain from a comfortable distance, appreciated its severity in the abstract way of a man who admired difficulty in principle, while ensuring it never inconvenienced him in practice. He had never needed to read it. He had never needed the Highlands to mean anything. Lachlan read it the way a man reads the face of someone he has known his entire life. Not by cataloguing features, but by understanding expression. He said little on the road. They had established an uneasy travelling silence in the first hour and found, without discussion, that it served them better than conversation. But he navigated without hesitation, choosing not the fastest routes, but the ones Euphemia would have chosen. The quieter coach roads and less travelled post routes that led north, without requiring a woman travelling alone with an infant to pass through any of the larger towns where a duchess in distress might attract the wrong kind of attention. "She is cleverer than you gave her credit for," Lachlan observed without inflection at the first inn, where the keeper's wife had confirmed. After careful, unhurried questioning conducted by Lachlan while Alistair stood in the yard pretending to see to the horses, having been firmly advised that his manner was not well suited to extracting information from ordinary people, that a young woman with a baby boy had stopped 3 days prior for warm milk and a rest, paid in coin, gave no name, and continued north on the Criff Road. "I gave her considerable credit," Alistair said. "You gave her credit for the qualities that were useful to you," Lachlan replied, without heat, in the tone of a man stating a fact rather than launching an attack. "Her patience, her composure in company, her ability to manage a household of 40 staff without once requesting your active involvement, her capacity to make your life run smoothly while asking nothing visible in return." He signaled for a second ale he did not particularly want. "Her capacity to vanish without leaving a traceable thread. That surprised you, it had." Alistair was honest enough with himself, in the privacy of the road, to acknowledge it fully. He had understood Euphemia as a woman of gentleness, of endurance, of a particular quiet grace that he had noted and categorized and filed under admirable without ever examining what it must have cost her to maintain. He had not understood her as a woman of strategy, of long planning, of the cold, deliberate resolve it required to organize an escape from a life while continuing to inhabit it without visible seam. He had been, it emerged, paying catastrophically insufficient attention. Each stopping point on the trail revised his understanding. At Callander, the coachman who had taken her the first leg recalled that she had asked not about the fastest route north, but the least travelled, the roads with the fewest estates of consequence along them, the fewest households that might have social connection to Ravenswick. At a farmhouse outside Comrie, a woman who let a room described a young mother who had soothed a wakeful infant through an entire rainy night without raising her voice, without showing distress, without asking for anything beyond what she had already paid for. Lovely composed thing, but her eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. At a village smithy north of Criff, a young apprentice of perhaps 15 recalled her with the particular clarity of a boy whose attention had been thoroughly captured. She had asked detailed questions about road conditions through the northern passes, which roads flooded in sustained rain, which bridges were reliable in November, which villages had a physician. She had listened with total focus, asked precise follow-up questions, and, when he had offered, apparently on his own initiative, clearly enchanted, to draw a rough map on brown paper, she had thanked him with a warmth that he described, 3 days later, to a duke and a former military officer, with the slightly dazed expression of someone recounting a visitation. "She kept the map," Lachlan said. "Of course she did." That evening in the tavern, spreading their own map across a scarred oak table with ale rings for topography, Lachlan traced the emerging line of her route with one finger. She has avoided every Kincaid tenant holding, every family of social connection, every posting house large enough to have a register that could be consulted. His finger moved north, then slightly east, toward the higher ground. She planned a route that makes her effectively invisible to anyone searching along conventional lines. How long would this have taken to plan? Alistair asked. Lachlan looked at him steadily across the map. In the firelight, his expression was not triumphant. It was something sadder than that. Weeks at minimum, possibly months. A pause, which means that while she was sitting at your dinner table and managing your household and carrying your son, she was also, quietly and without your knowledge, making a plan to leave you. She was simultaneously present and already gone. The fire snapped. Rain moved against the tavern windows with the familiar persistence that had followed them north without ceasing since they left Ravenswick. The question you should be sitting with tonight, Lachlan continued, folding the map with the precision of a man accustomed to field operations, is not simply where she went. It is what she must have felt every day inside that house to make this level of planning feel not like an extreme measure, but like the only reasonable one available to her. Alistair stared at the table for a moment, then, I know what she felt. Do you? Morven was sufficiently thorough. He turned his glass slowly in his hands. Euphemia felt invisible. She felt she had been admitted to a life and then excluded from the person at the center of it. She felt, correctly, that I treated her presence as a convenience and her feelings as an administrative matter. He set the glass down. I know what she felt because it is what I would have felt, and I have spent 34 years ensuring I would never have to. Lachlan said nothing for a long moment. Then use it, he said, finally. When you find her, not if when, do not arrive as a duke reclaiming what belongs to him. Do not invoke the law or the title or the heir. Arrive as a man who has finally had the courage to feel the damage he caused, and is asking, not demanding, the chance to repair it. He met Alistair's eyes. She is not a problem to be solved. She stopped believing she mattered to you. There is only one answer to that. I know, Alistair said. It was quiet. The fire burned low. Outside, the Highland dark pressed against the glass without apology. It was the most honest thing he had said in 3 years, and they both understood it. The village of Ardcalish sat in a fold of the Highland landscape, as though the hills had simply grown up around it and forgotten to leave space. It was small enough to have no posting house, no inn of consequence, only a scattering of stone cottages and a church whose bell tower listed slightly westward, as though leaning away from the wind. In summer, it would be unremarkable. In November, wrapped in low cloud and the smell of peat smoke and wet bracken, it was invisible from the main road, which was precisely why Euphemia had stopped there. She had arrived 4 days earlier, exhausted and rain-soaked, with Ainsley bundled against her chest and a traveling bag that had grown heavier with every mile. The woman who kept the let-room above the Chandlers, a widow named Mrs. Fenwick, broad and unhurried and blessedly incurious, had taken one look at the state of them and ushered them inside without questions. Euphemia had slept for 11 hours. When she woke, she had lain in the unfamiliar bed in the unfamiliar room and listened to Ainsley breathing in the small crib Miss Fenwick had produced from a back room, and she had thought, this is the quietest morning I have had in 3 years. The grief came later, as it always does, not in the dramatic avalanche she had half expected, but in small ambushes, the way she reached, automatically, for the bell pull on the second morning before remembering there was none. The moment Ainsley smiled for the first time that week, and she had no one to turn to. The evening she sat by the window with her tea cooling in her hands and watched the rain move across the hills and understood, with terrible clarity, that she did not miss Ravenswick. She missed the idea of Ravenswick, the idea of what a marriage was supposed to feel like from inside those walls. the version of Alastair she had spent 3 years hoping she might someday reach. "You're a great thinker for a young woman, Mrs. Fenwick observed one afternoon, setting a plate of oatcakes on the table beside her without fanfare. "You'll think yourself into knots if you're not careful." "I have a great deal to think about," Euphemia said. "Aye, and most of it will still be there tomorrow." The widow sat down heavily in the opposite chair. "The bairn is well. You are well. Whatever drove you here. It will sort itself, or it will not. But it will not sort itself faster for worrying at it like a loose thread." Euphemia looked at her. "How long did it take you after your husband died?" Fenwick considered this with the honesty of a woman who did not traffic in comfortable answers. 3 years before I stopped expecting to hear his boots in the hall," she said. "Longer than that before I stopped being angry at him for leaving. Though I suppose that is a different situation than yours." Is it?" Euphemia said softly. The widow looked at her steadily, asked nothing. It was one of the qualities Euphemia had come in 4 days to value enormously. She had not decided what she was going to do. This was the truth she had not been prepared for. That flight, once accomplished, revealed a horizon she had not thought past. She had imagined, in the long private months of planning, that escape would feel like resolution. That to be gone from Ravenswick would mean to be free of it. Instead, she found herself carrying the marriage with her as one carries a splinter. Invisible to others, impossible to ignore, occasionally forgotten for an hour at a time and then suddenly unbearably present. He will come for Ainsley. She knew this with absolute certainty. Whatever Alastair felt or did not feel for her, the heir to Ravenswick was not something Duke of Ravenswick would accept losing. He would come. He would be controlled and correct and cold, and he would invoke legal right and ducal authority, and he would look at her, across whatever room they found themselves in, with that expression she had never been able to fully decode. The one that lived somewhere between indifference and something she had occasionally, dangerously, mistaken for its opposite. She had written to Lachlan before she left. Not to ask him to prevent Alastair from following. She was too honest with herself for that. She knew Lachlan could not stop him, and had not truly expected him to. She had written because she needed someone in the world to know where she was, to know that she had done this deliberately, with her eyes open, and that she was not lost. She was, in fact, for the first time in 3 years, exactly where she had chosen to be. She lifted Ainsley from the crib and carried him to the window, and together they watched the cloud move across the face of the hills in slow grey procession. And she held him tighter than was strictly necessary, and she breathed. "I do not know what comes next," she told him silently, pressing her lips to his soft dark hair. "But I know I will not go back to being nothing." Outside, the road that led to Ardcalich was empty. The hills were patient. The rain fell without urgency, for now they were still ahead of it. The road through the Quillen foothills was not a road in any civilized sense of the word. It was a suggestion, a narrowing of the landscape's hostility. A place where the ground was marginally less determined to swallow a horse whole than the terrain on either side of it. Alastair had stopped remarking on the conditions 2 days prior. Partly because complaint served no purpose, and partly because Lachlan's expression at each new deterioration of the path communicated, without words, that this was precisely the kind of country his sister had chosen for precisely this reason. They had picked up her trail again that morning, a woman and infant, described by a crofter's wife, with the careful neutrality of someone who had decided the young mother deserved her privacy, heading northeast toward a cluster of villages tucked into the hills above the loch. The trail was fresh. At most 2 days ahead, Alastair rode with a focus that had replaced, somewhere north of Crieff, the frantic urgency of the first morning. He was not calm. He was not sure he would be calm again for some considerable time, but he had settled into something more useful than panic. A steady, forward-moving purpose, cold and clear as the November air. It was Lachlan who saw the figure on the road first. He pulled his horse up with a sharp word and a hand raised, and Alistair drew alongside him and looked where he was looking, and understood immediately why they had both stopped. The man standing in the road ahead was not a traveller. He was too still for that, too planted, both feet wide on the frozen ground, his arms loose at his sides, in the specific posture of a man who has decided that this is where something is going to happen. Brennan Strathmore, Lachlan's younger cousin, a man Alistair had met precisely once at the wedding and found immediately unpleasant, looked at them, across 30 yards of Highland Road, with an expression that made very clear he had not come to exchange pleasantries. "She asked me to watch the road," Brennan said. His voice carried easily. He was a large man, broader than Lachlan, with the same dark Strathmore colouring but none of his cousin's discipline. She did not want him followed. "Brennan," Lachlan said carefully. "She is my cousin, Lachlan, same as she is yours." His eyes moved to Alistair with an uncomplicated hostility. "He does not pass. Stand aside," Alistair said. It was, perhaps, not the most judicious opening. Brennan moved with a speed that belied his size. He covered the distance between them in seconds, reached up, and seized Alistair by the lapel, with the grip of a man who had spent his working life on Highland estates where physical work was not optional. Alistair's horse shied violently. He went sideways out of the saddle, not falling, not quite, but losing enough ground that when Brennan hauled him the rest of the way down, he landed on the frozen road with a force that drove the breath from his body in a single hard exhalation. He was on his feet in the next moment, but Brennan was already on him, and whatever advantages Alistair possessed, and he was not without them. He was lean and fast and had not spent his life entirely behind a desk. Brennan outweighed him by 4 stone and had the specific, unhesitating violence of a man with nothing to lose, and a great deal of protective feeling to discharge. The road was not a gentleman's venue for dispute resolution. It was frozen ground and loose stone, and the indifferent observation of Highland hills, and the fight that happened on it was not elegant. Alistair took a blow to the jaw that rattled his teeth and sent light across his vision in brief, inconvenient constellations. He landed his own, 2 solid, neither of which appeared to produce the desired deterrent effect on a man built like a Highland steer. Enough. Lachlan's voice was not loud. It had the quality of a command issued by a man accustomed to being obeyed on a battlefield, and it worked on Brennan the way it had presumably worked on younger soldiers in worse situations. Not immediately, but within the next 3 seconds, as the authority in it penetrated through the heat of the moment. Brennan stepped back, breathing hard. His eyes still locked on Alistair with an expression that made clear this was a pause rather than a conclusion. Alistair straightened, touched 2 fingers to his jaw. They came away with a small amount of blood from a cut above the bone, and he looked at it with the detached assessment of a man taking inventory. "Brennan," Lachlan said, moving between them with the practiced ease of a man who had separated fighting men before. "He knows what he did. He is not riding north to enforce a legal claim or to punish her for leaving. I have been watching him for 4 days. He paused. He is riding north because without her, without both of them, he has nothing left that means anything, and he is only beginning to understand what that means." Brennan looked at his cousin, then back at Alistair. "If she does not want to see him, then she will tell him so herself," Lachlan said. "And he will accept it, won't you?" It was not entirely a question. Alistair held Brennan's gaze. His jaw ached. The cut above it stung in the cold air. He was standing on a frozen highland road with blood on his face and mud on his coat, and he was, in this moment, further from the Duke of Ravenswick than he had been at any point in his adult life. "Yes," he said, simply, without qualification. Brennan studied him for a long moment with the unsubtle scrutiny of a man who distrusts refinement on principle. Whatever he found, or did not find, he stepped aside. "The village is 4 miles northeast," he said. "She is at the Chandler's widow's house." He looked at Alistair one final time. "She has the boy with her. If I hear anything I do not like—" "You won't," Alistair said. He remounted. Lachlan fell in beside him. Neither spoke for some time, the horses picking their careful way along the frozen road while the hills held their silence around them. "Your jaw," Lachlan said eventually. "I know it will swell, I know." A pause. Something moved briefly across Lachlan's expression that was not quite amusement, but lived in the same general neighborhood. He said nothing more. Ahead, the road curved northeast. 4 miles. The afternoon light was already failing, gold going to grey at the edges of the hills, and somewhere in the fold of the landscape beyond the next rise. In a village, small enough to be invisible from any road worth travelling, a woman was about to run out of time to decide what she wanted to do next. Alistair rode toward her, with blood drying on his face and his heart, for the first time in 34 years, entirely undefended. Morven arrived in Ardcallish the following morning. Nobody had told her to come. Nobody had needed to. She had watched her cousin ride north with Lachlan Strathmore, in a configuration that had all the hallmarks of a situation about to require skilled intervention, and she had given them 3 days' head start before following at her own pace and in her own carriage, with a letter of introduction to Mrs. Fenwick drafted from pure inference and a travelling bag packed for a week. She was, as she had always been, several steps ahead of the situation. Mrs. Fenwick received her with the particular wariness of a woman who had promised a frightened young mother a measure of peace and was now watching that promise be eroded by successive arrivals. Morven disarmed her in under 10 minutes. She had a gift for this, the rapid establishment of trust, which she deployed without cynicism because she genuinely liked people, and they could tell, and was shown up the narrow stair to the room above the Chandler's with a cup of tea and instructions not to upset the baby. Euphemia was sitting by the window when Morven entered. She had Ainsley on her lap, and she was doing the thing she often did when her mind was working, tracing patterns on the back of his hand with one finger, round and round, while she looked at something outside the glass that had nothing to do with the view. She turned when she heard the door, and for a moment, just a moment, before composure reasserted itself, something moved across her face that was raw and unguarded and entirely honest. "Of course," she said softly. "Of course you came. Did you think I wouldn't?" Morven set down her tea, sat across from her without ceremony, and looked at her with the careful attention of someone genuinely interested in what they find. "You look better than I feared." "I look terrible," Euphemia said, with a tired precision that was almost humor. "You look like a woman who has been sleeping," Morven said, "which is more than you looked like in October." Euphemia was quiet. She shifted Ainsley against her hip, and he made the small, contented noise he made when rearranged, and she pressed her lips briefly to his head. "He is here," Morven said, not gently, not harshly, simply as a fact requiring acknowledgement. "Alastair, he arrived yesterday evening. He is at the inn at the bottom of the village, and he has a cut on his jaw that suggests Brennan found the road before he did." Something complicated moved through Euphemia's expression. "Is he? He is well. It is superficial." Morven paused. "He has not come to the Chandler's house. He has not sent word. He is simply present, waiting." "For what?" "For you to decide what you want." Euphemia looked at her. "That does not sound like Alistair." "No," Morven agreed, "it doesn't." The fire in the small grate crackled between them. Outside, the highland morning was pale and very still, the kind of stillness that comes after prolonged rain when the landscape is simply resting. "I do not know how to trust it," Euphemia said quietly. "I do not know how to look at a change and believe it is real and not simply strategy, another form of management." Her voice was even, but the effort of keeping it so was visible to Morven, who was watching closely. "He is very good at management." "He is," Morven said, "but I have known him since we were children, and I know every register of his performance, and what I saw on his face the morning he found the nursery empty was not strategy." She leaned forward slightly. It was a man realizing, with complete and devastating clarity, that he had spent years constructing a fortress and had just discovered it was a tomb. Euphemia's breath caught very slightly. "I am not asking you to forgive him," Morven said. "I am not asking you to go back to what you had. Because what you had was not a marriage. It was an arrangement that damaged you quietly and thoroughly over 3 years. I am asking you to consider whether the man who rode 4 days through a Highland November with your brother watching his every move, and submitted to it and said nothing and kept riding, might be worth one conversation." A long silence. Ainsley had fallen asleep against Euphemia's shoulder with the absolute trust of the very young. "There is something else," Euphemia said at last. Her hand moved briefly to her abdomen, a small, involuntary gesture that she caught almost immediately, but not quite quickly enough. Morven said nothing, she simply waited. "I am," Euphemia began, stopped. The composure she had maintained so carefully for days wavered once, completely, and then steadied. "I am with child, 8 weeks, I believe, perhaps 9. The room held the news gently. "He does not know," Morven said. "He does not know, Euphemia. I know." She looked at her hands. "I know what it means. I know what you are going to say. I needed to know that I was leaving because I could no longer stay. Not because of this. I needed this to be my decision, made for my own reasons before it became complicated by duty, or his or anyone's." Morven looked at her with something very close to admiration. "Will you see him?" The fire breathed. Ainsley slept. Outside, the road through Ardcallish was quiet and pale in the winter morning, and somewhere at its lower end, a duke was sitting in an inn with a cut on his jaw, not sending word, simply to be told whether he had any right to be there at all. "Tomorrow," Euphemia said. "Tell him tomorrow, in the morning." She looked down at Ainsley. "I need one more night to be certain of myself." "I'll tell him," Morven said. She picked up her tea. They sat together in the quiet, 2 women on either side of a fire, and the morning continued its pale, unhurried business around them. The morning arrived iron-grey and silent, the kind of Highland morning that offers no reassurance, only light, flat and functional, sufficient to see by and nothing more. Alistair was awake before it. He had slept in installments, surfacing every hour or so into the cold dark of the inn-room with the immediate, pressing awareness of where he was and why, and then lying still and waiting for the next grey increment of dawn. He had, over the course of the night, rehearsed and discarded 17 different versions of what he intended to say. Each one sounded, in the cold, honest dark, like a man managing a situation. Each one sounded like the Duke of Ravenswick. He arrived at the Chandler's house at 8 o'clock, with nothing prepared. This was, he had decided somewhere around 3 in the morning, the only honest approach available to him. Mrs. Fenwick opened the door, looked at him with the measuring expression of a woman who has formed an opinion and is deciding whether to revise it, and stood aside without a word. He climbed the narrow stair. He knocked at the door at the top with one knuckle, quietly, the way you knock when you are not certain of your welcome and do not wish to force the matter. A pause, then, "Come in." She was standing at the window. Not sitting, standing with her arms loosely crossed, in the posture of someone who has decided to face this on their feet rather than be found in a chair. She was wearing a plain grey dress he had never seen before, purchased here, presumably, and her hair was simply arranged, and she looked nothing like the Duchess of Ravenswick, and entirely like herself. And he understood, with a force that stopped him just inside the doorway, that he had never properly looked at her. Ainsley was in the crib in the corner, asleep. "You came a long way," Euphemia said. "Yes, you brought Lachlan." He brought himself. I was not given a great deal of choice in the matter. Something moved at the edge of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but its ghost. "That sounds like him." He moved carefully to the center of the room, not toward her, simply away from the door so that the space between them was honest and open, and neither of them was blocking anything. "I am not going to tell you," he said, "that I did not mean what I said. I have given that a great deal of consideration over the past week, and I have concluded that it would be both false and insulting, and you deserve neither from me." He paused. "I said it because I was afraid. That is the entire explanation. It is insufficient. I know that." Euphemia watched him steadily. "I said it because you had just looked at me in a way that no one has looked at me since I was a boy, with the specific expectation that I might, if asked, produce something genuine, and I did not know how to bear it. And so I dismantled it." His voice was even, but his hands, she noticed, were not entirely still. "I am very good at dismantling things. I have spent my entire life perfecting the technique." "I know," she said quietly. "I was not, I have never been, indifferent to you." He said it simply, without rhetorical architecture, which was the only way she would have believed it. "What I felt for you I did not have language for, and so I buried it under the language I did have, which was the language of function and arrangement and duty. I made you a category. I did so because the alternative, which was to acknowledge that you had become necessary to me, that I looked for you in rooms before I was conscious of doing so, that the house was a different quality of dark on the nights you were not in it. The alternative was to admit a vulnerability I had been taught from the age of 7 was tantamount to weakness." The fire in the small grate was the only sound for a moment. "Your father," Euphemia said. "My father," he agreed. She unfolded her arms. It was a small gesture, and he did not miss it. "I am with child," she said. He was very still. 8 weeks. Perhaps 9. She held his gaze. "I am telling you now because you deserve to know, and because I will not have it said that I withheld it as leverage. It changes nothing about what I require from you. It is simply true." Not quickly, carefully, as you move toward something that may yet startle and leave. He stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her face, which was composed and clear-eyed, and showed every sign of a woman who had prepared herself for every possible version of this moment. "Tell me what you require," he said. "Not what the law provides. Not what the title demands. Tell me what you, Euphemia, require from me, and I will tell you honestly whether I am capable of it." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the village in one long pass and then was quiet. "I require," she said carefully, "to be seen, not performed for, not managed. Seen as the person I am, with a mind and a grief and an opinion worth the effort of your attention." She paused. "I require you to say what you feel when you feel it, before it becomes a weapon. I require you to be present in the house, not merely resident in it." Another pause, the longest one. "And I require you to understand that if you are incapable of these things, I would rather raise 2 children in a chandler's widow's spare room in the Highlands than return to a life in which I am invisible." "Those are not unreasonable requirements," Alistair said. "No," she agreed, "they are not." "I cannot promise you perfection," he said. "I have 34 years of contrary habit, and I am not fool enough to suggest they will dissolve overnight." "I am not asking for perfection," Euphemia said. "I am asking for effort. Genuine, sustained, unglamorous effort. The kind that no one sees and that does not benefit your reputation in the slightest. The ghost of a smile again, a little more present this time. I am asking you to be a husband rather than a duke. From the crib in the corner, Ainsley stirred. One small fist emerged from the blanket, opened, closed. Opened again, the unconscious semaphore of an infant negotiating his dreams. They both looked at him, then at each other. I would like to try, Alistair said. It was the smallest sentence he had ever offered in place of the largest thing he had ever meant. Euphemia held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she turned to the crib and lifted Ainsley, who surfaced from sleep with his customary composure, and she turned back and held him out. Alistair took his son. Carefully with both hands, the way you hold something irreplaceable when you have only recently understood its value. Ainsley's blinked at him with the wide, uncritical attention of the very young, and made no objection. Tomorrow, Euphemia said, we will talk about what this looks like. Practically. Tomorrow, Alistair agreed. For today, it was enough. They did not return to Ravenswick immediately. This was Morven's suggestion, offered the morning after the meeting in the Chandler's room, with the practical authority of a woman who understands that reconciliation, like new bone, requires time in stillness before it can bear weight. She recommended a fortnight in Ardcalish, not for sentiment, but for structure. Time for the architecture of a new arrangement to be agreed upon before the old building closed around them again. Lachlan objected, on the grounds that a Highland village in November was no place for an infant, a pregnant woman, and 2 men with unresolved feelings about each other. Morven pointed out that the infant was thriving. The woman had survived the previous fortnight without difficulty, and the 2 men could either manage their feelings or sleep in the stable. Lachlan withdrew his objection. Brennan went home. He shook Alistair's hand on his way out of the village, briefly, without warmth, but without hostility either, which was, all things considered, a significant diplomatic achievement. The days in Ardcalish had a quality Alistair had not encountered before and had no existing vocabulary, for they were quiet, not the institutional quiet of Ravenswick, which was the silence of a well-managed establishment. Surfaces maintained, machinery suppressed, all inconvenient noise routed away from the ducal rooms. This was a different order of quiet entirely, the quiet of a small house where the fire needed tending, and the baby needed feeding, and the wind came down from the hills at 4 in the afternoon and rattled the window casements, and there was simply no apparatus available to manage any of it away. He learned things he had not known. That Euphemia took her tea without sugar, but would accept 1 piece of shortbread if it was offered without comment. That she had a habit, when reading, of pressing 2 fingers lightly to her temple, as though steadying her concentration. That she spoke to Ainsley in full sentences, complete and thoughtful, as though his incomprehension was a temporary administrative matter, and not a reason to simplify the conversation. He learned that she was funny, not decoratively, not in the polished social register he had observed at dinner parties, but with a quiet, dry precision that arrived without warning. On the 4th morning, watching him attempt to reconstruct a crib rail that had come loose in the night, she observed that it was reassuring to know the Duke of Ravenswick was not entirely without practical skills, and that the estate carpenter was simply doing his best under the circumstances to remain employed. He had laughed, genuinely, without social calculation, and she had looked at him with the particular attention of someone encountering something new, and said nothing. Progress was not linear. There were evenings that closed down between them like a shutter, hours in which the old habits reasserted themselves, his silence calcifying, her composure becoming the careful thing it had been for 3 years, rather than the natural thing it could be, and they would navigate these by small mutual adjustments, the way two people learn to move through a narrow space without collision. Neither of them pretended these moments were not happening. That, in itself, was new. Lachlan left on the 8th day, having satisfied himself not entirely, but sufficiently, that his sister was not being managed or coerced. His farewell to Alistair was brief and characteristically direct. "I will be watching," he said. "I know," Alistair said. "Good." Lachlan paused. Something shifted in his expression. An infinitesimal recalibration, the kind that costs a proud man something. "She chose you once," he said. "Whatever you think of that choice, she made it with her whole self. That is what she does. Do not make her regret it twice." "No," Alistair said. "I don't intend to." It was not friendship, but it was the beginning of something that could, with sustained effort and adequate patience on both sides, eventually grow into something that resembled it. They returned to Ravenswick on a Thursday in late November, arriving in the early afternoon when the house was lit against the grey sky and the staff were assembled in the entrance hall, with the collective expression of people who had spent a fortnight managing uncertainty and were profoundly relieved to have something concrete to do about it. Alistair carried Ainsley inside himself. He was aware of the significance of this, of the small choreography of it, visible to every person in the entrance hall, and he did not perform it. He simply did it, because the child was heavy and warm against his shoulder, and he had spent a fortnight discovering that holding him was not a duty, but a specific, irreplaceable comfort. Euphemia walked beside him, not behind. The housekeeper, a woman of 30 years' service and supreme observational acuity, met Euphemia's eyes briefly in the entrance hall and dropped the faintest nod, the nod of a woman communicating that she had kept faith with the household during a difficult fortnight, and expected the same consideration in return. Euphemia returned it with the small, precise gravity it deserved. Morven departed the following morning, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has done good work and has the wisdom not to belabor it. She kissed Euphemia on both cheeks at the door of the carriage, held her hands briefly, and said, at low volume and with great precision, "Send for me if you need me, and tell him when you need something. Do not wait for him to notice. He is improving, but he has 34 years to overcome, and he will miss things." "I know," Euphemia said, "and Euphemia." Morven met her eyes. "You were never nothing. I want you to hear that from someone who was watching and knows." The carriage moved off down the avenue. Euphemia stood at the door until it turned the bend and the Highland oaks closed behind it. She stood there a moment longer, in the cold air, with the house at her back, its weight, its history, its long stone patience. Then she went inside. That evening, after Ainsley had been settled and the house had moved into its nighttime register, Alistair found Euphemia in the library. Not in the chair where she customarily sat during the social hours they had always spent in the same room, without quite being together, but at the desk, reading, with her feet tucked beneath her in a manner that was entirely comfortable and not remotely Duchess-like. She looked up when he entered. He crossed the room and sat, not in his usual chair across the room, but in the one nearest the desk, close enough that the lamplight covered both of them. He did not speak immediately. He picked up his book. She returned to hers. They read in silence for an hour, but it was a different silence than all the silences that had preceded it. It was inhabited. It was chosen. It was two people in the same small warmth of light who were no longer pretending that proximity was the same thing as presence. Outside, the wind came down from the north the way it always did, and Ravenswick received it the way it had received everything for 300 years, with the steady, unyielding patience of a thing that has survived long enough to know that weather passes. Inside, A duke and his wife sat together in the lamplight, and the fire burned. And the house, for the first time in a very long while, felt like something other than a monument to everything that had not yet been said. It felt in its cautious, provisional, genuinely hopeful way like a home. The ledger for this tale is finally closed, but the shadows of history never truly sleep. If your heart is still racing, my beautiful family, don't let the fire die out here. These two stories on your screen are even darker, deeper, and more unforgiving. Tap subscribe so we stay found in the fog, then click one now. Your next obsession has already begun.